Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the LSE. My name is Andrés Rodríguez Pose, and I hold the Princesa Victoria's Chair and direct the Cañada Blanche Center, and I'm going to be your host today. But it's not about me in any way. This afternoon, we have the great privilege of having with us Mrs. Nadia Calviño, who will be in dialogue with our own President and Vice Chancellor, Baroness Minouche Shafik. Mrs. Calviño is currently the first Vice President or the first Deputy Prime Minister, I don't know how to translate this adequately into English terms, of Spain, and the Minister for the Economy and Digitalization. She also chairs the International Monetary and Financial Committee of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF in other words, and she has a 2-year mandate on that. Mrs. Calviño is an economist and a lawyer by training, and she has a wealth of experience working first for the Ministry of the Economy in Spain, and later for 12 years in many high-powered jobs at the European Commission, including the all-powerful, and I've seen her in action when she was there, Director General in charge of the budget before becoming a minister in Spain. She has lectured at the Faculty of Economics at the University Complutense of Madrid, my alma mater as well, and she has published a large number of articles and amongst other honors and titles, she has been awarded the Women and Technology Award in 2021, the Master of Digital Award, the Fernandez Latorre Journalism Prize, the 2012 Women's Leadership Award, and the 2007 Public Sector Under 40 Lawyer of the Year Award by the Iberian Lawyer magazine. Last but not least, and I think that's probably the most important in this environment, she has a strong connection to the LSE as her daughter, Alina, completed the MSc in Environmental Policy and Regulation just a few years ago. And Mrs. Calviño will be in dialogue with Baroness Minouche Shafik, who needs no introduction here, but nevertheless, I would say that she's a leading economist whose career has straddled public policy and academia. She was appointed President and Vice Chancellor, so our former directors of the London School of Economics. Already time has passed, so in September 2017, so 6 years. And she would sadly, I think sadly for many of us and for the LSE, would be leaving us for pastures new, taking over the presidency of Columbia University in New York. She did her BA at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and her MSc at LSE. So you can see many of you are following in very important footsteps. And she has a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. At the age of 36, she became the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank, which is quite an achievement. And she has taught at Georgetown University and at the Wharton Business School. She later served as permanent secretary of the Department for International Development from 2008 to 2011. She was deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund from 2011 to 2014. And deputy governor of the Bank of England from 2014 to 2017 before coming to the LSE. And there she sat on all the monetary, financial, and prudential policy committees and was responsible for a balance sheet of over 500 billion. Minouche has served on and chaired numerous boards and currently serves as trustee of the British Museum, the Supervisory Board of Siemens, the Council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Economic Honours Committee. She was made Dame Commander of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthdays Honours List in 2015, and in July 2020, she was made Crossbench Peer in the House of Lords. But more than both of their remarkable achievements, I think you're going to enjoy what you're going to hear now. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Madame Vice President to the podium because it's our great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is entirely yours.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Rodriguez Pose. It is such a great pleasure to be here today. This is probably one of the best moments, if not the best of my week. I have to tell you, it is such a great pleasure to be here to share this afternoon with all of you, and most importantly, to share the table and the discussion with the President and Vice Chancellor, Baroness Shafik, dear Minouche. And it is a particularly appealing to me to be able to share some thoughts on current global challenges, their implications for theory and policy. And I will try to be provocative, as I always am, and try to leave some questions and some maybe new ideas with you. Because to me, it is particularly important to share these thoughts with young people. It is very inspiring to see you all today. You are the leaders of the future, and it is extremely important that we listen to you and that we encourage you to actively engage in the public discussions, in shaping the policies, particularly at this point in time when so many changes are taking place, which are going to have a long influence for decades to come. So I think I take this as a very important conversation that we will be having, and looking forward to your interesting, I am sure, stimulating questions after we start the exchange with Madame Shafik. Now, early warning. My aim is not at all to provide all the answers, but rather, as I said, to be provocative, to put forward some key questions, to question also some preconceived ideas and dogmas, to outline key lessons learned from history that can maybe help us design the economic paradigm that, in my view, is in the making. And finally, I'd like to seize this opportunity, being in such with so many brilliant minds in one of the best universities in the world. I am going to give you some homework. So as we look around, it is quite obvious that our world is going through massive changes that are having a profound impact on our international economy. We are in the midst of a tectonic shift in the global order that prevails since the end of World War II. And just looking back to the last 5 years, we have lived through a pandemic, war in Europe, an exponential acceleration of digitalization, and increased awareness of our societies and reinforced determination to tackle the consequences of climate change. On top of being one of the hardest hit countries in Europe from the great financial crisis and then the pandemic, in Spain, we had a bonus track. We had a volcano eruption in 2021 in the Canary Islands. So unprecedented is probably one of the most used words in all public statements since 2020. But is it really so? Is there really no record in history of pandemics, wars, inflationary pressures, trade and geopolitical tensions? Well, of course not. Of course, many of the circumstances we are living are not unprecedented. Crises are actually an integral part of economic history. Each of them is different in their origin, in their development and end, but each of them and all of them together provide useful insights for current times. Economic theory has evolved to a great extent due to conflict, due to the need to respond to crisis. And I think economic theory can help us take the right decisions and bring new perspectives to some ongoing debates. Many of today's challenges have been building since the turn of the century, with emerging economies becoming global superpowers, globalization leading to interconnected value chains, outsourcing and world competition leading to the concentration of market power in some companies and countries, the interconnectedness of financial markets leading to interdependence and systemic risks, new technologies leading to large digital hyperscalers, input dependency, growing threats to security and privacy, and a changing balance of world power. not to speak about the implications of all these changes on our work, our lives, and Western democracies, an issue that we have been discussing just before the beginning of this conversation, of this event. The great financial crisis, I think, was a turning point, an eye-opening historical moment when the prevailing theoretical and policy paradigm failed, when we realized the risks of globalization and light touch regulation, the limits of self-stabilizing markets. Spain, as I said already, was severely hit and suffered a lost decade of subdued growth, social unrest, and geopolitical fragmentation after the great financial crisis broke in 2008. And then, as we were recovering from that crisis, we were again severely hit by a worldwide pandemic with a huge human toll. And then by a war in Europe as energy shock and high inflation in advanced economies. So all of this has proven to be a phenomenal challenge for our economies, our firms, our families, and of course, also for policymakers and academics. In my view, 2008 marked the end of the economic paradigm prevailing for decades. Only maybe a lot of people didn't realize at the time, or actually they didn't want it to lead to changes. It is only now, after a pandemic and a war, that we're starting to see a new approach, which requires us to develop what probably Minouche would call a new social contract. We need to go back to basics in economic policy, which means protection against uncertainty, preserving stability and confidence in our societies, supporting economic and social progress. We learned some of the lessons of the great financial crisis. Economists in these last 2 decades have started to pay much more attention to some key features that were neglected until then, such as the importance of geography and social cohesion, an issue that I know is very dear to Professor Rodriguez-Posse. The need to integrate irrational or herd behavior, sentiment in our dear Homo economicus. It's not only about economics, it's not only about rational expectations. The need to use data and experiment instead of running complex financial models, the need to take account of digitalization and environmental sustainability. We certainly have made progress, but we're still missing some building blocks of a really complete, coherent economic paradigm that integrates the lessons from history that can help us have a good understanding of current developments and guide us going forward. And I think these knowledge gaps explain the inability of our collective wisdom to foresee or anticipate many relevant developments. And let me just mention some examples. And I'm not talking about getting wrong the likelihood and potential impact of a massive health crisis, such as the pandemic, because one could argue this was a black swan. Okay. But, you know, economists seem to have been surprised by the implications of high dependency on some countries or regions for strategic inputs, from masks and basic health equipment to oil and gas, grains and other raw materials and semiconductors. When everyone was looking at the possible impact of dollar appreciation on emerging economies very far from here, it was the UK sovereign debt market that suffered a period of intense financial stress. Many wise persons were worried about secular stagnation and low for long interest rates just before we rediscovered that wars fuel inflation that can be higher and more persistent than anticipated. And just as mainstream analysts and authorities insisted on the risks of the non-bank sector, an intense episode of financial instability has been triggered a few weeks ago by a bank that had deposit of wealthy individuals and firms in one of the fastest growing, richest regions of the world as its main liability, and US sovereign debt as its main asset. You know, talking about getting things wrong. The burst of the crypto bubble is probably the only non-surprise coming from the fast rising interest rates that we have been able to anticipate. So there are very good reasons to turn textbooks upside down, to question acquired ideas and have an open mind to develop new tools. This is not new, because throughout history, our understanding of economics has evolved over time, shaped by changing social, philosophical, and political relations. The agricultural evolution explains the focus on land as the main source of wealth. The Industrial Revolution, the surge of capitalism, led to the prevalence of classical political economists and philosophers just round the corner from here. They were developing in this very neighborhood tools and policy guidelines based on this construct of the homo economicus that takes rational decisions on the basis of perfect information and incentives, focus on incentives. Then the Great Depression led to the prevalence of Keynesianism, stagflation to the surge of monetarism. Neoclassic macroeconomists were very comfortable with the opening up of world markets, the expansion of trade and financial innovation. The WTO Uruguay round approved deregulation, ultra-liberal governments in the US, in the UK. New Keynesianism was also the intellectual backbone of the third way. More recently, economists are looking at a broader array of issues and interacting much more with other disciplines, as I mentioned a moment ago, because economics has influenced the way policymakers have responded to economic crisis, and the other way around. The economic theories, economic academic theory and work has also evolved on the basis of public policies. Now, back to today's world. The pandemic and the ongoing war in Ukraine have increased the urgency of addressing long-standing structural challenges such as digitalization, the fight against climate change, and the secondary effects of globalization. These crises have stressed the importance of investing in public goods, such as healthcare, that could not be provided by the market alone. The need to preserve strategic autonomy through reducing reliance on carbon fuels, ensuring energy efficiency, and deploying renewable energies to ensure clean and affordable energy supply, protecting the competitiveness and the welfare of European citizens and firms. Furthermore, the pandemic and the war have exposed the fragility of global value chains and the vulnerability of many economies, bringing to light the importance of investing in resilience. On the positive side, conversely to past experience, the response to the pandemic has also proven to be very effective, ensuring financial stability and a fast and strong recovery. Because in stark contrast to the past financial crisis, we were able to act in a coordinated manner at both European and global level. We were able to develop vaccines in a very short period of time and to deploy vaccination programs that cover entire populations, thanks to cooperation across countries and also between public and private actors. We also coordinated our fiscal and monetary policies in a manner that allowed governments to respond to an unprecedented economic and social shock. You see, I am using the word unprecedented myself. After I said this is not unprecedented. Well, the depth and the speed of the drop was certainly unprecedented in peaceful times, at least in the case of Spain. The EU provided a strong united response to the pandemic with short-term liquidity support to protect the economy, and the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan, a massive investment and reform program to drive a strong recovery, leading to a more modern economy along the lines of the green and digital agendas. Because conversely to past experiences, key international players and global financial institutions were aligned in their diagnosis, in their political approach. This time around, we all felt we were on the same boat and that this was the time for solidarity. And all authorities were also aligned in coordinating their policy responses, gearing fiscal and monetary policies to supporting activity and employment, ensuring financial stability. So this shows that different economic policies lead to different outcomes. And what we need now is to integrate this experience in our economic thinking. Because traditional models are not of so much use, historical elasticities are not informative to explain some of the features that we see in this new economic cycle. The shape of the Phillips curve is being revised. The theoretical construct is being challenged. And policy objectives in parallel keep piling up. Fight inflation, keep your debt sustainable, finance the twin transitions, fight climate change, reduce inequality, ensure strategic autonomy. So we pretty much have to turn our textbooks upside down, have another look at the different issues and what to do. I think history actually provides valuable lessons. And I think it is essential that we adjust our analytical tools to be able to respond to new realities. Let me just outline 10 of the building blocks that need to be taken into account going forward, both for academics and policymakers. First, we must rethink the way we measure economic success. Currently, the emphasis continues to be on economic growth and on the impact of government policies on GDP. For many years now, this excessive focus on GDP as the economic indicator of success has faced criticism from prominent economists because it does not reflect well digital services, environmental impact, public goods, the economies of care, just to mention a few more recent gaps. We need to work on this. We must also reflect on the traditional split between public consumption and investment. A growing number of studies estimate very substantial returns on investing in researchers, in educational and vocational training, fighting child poverty and gender violence. Not to speak about physical, digital, and legal security, well-functioning institutions, or investment in education. So public goods are a substantial part of economic performance, which is not well captured by our models because of this distinction between consumption and public investment. A third point, a third reflection I'd like to leave with you is I think reality shows the limits of creative destruction. If there is one thing we have learned from the pandemic is that it is much more efficient and cheaper to protect than to let something be destroyed and then have to rebuild from scratch. The Spanish experience after the great financial crisis and now after the pandemic is, I think, a striking example of how it is much more efficient from all points of view, also fiscal responsibility, to try to protect in these specific circumstances, of course. Flexibility to adjust is obviously a key lever for economic efficiency, but it can also lead to structural damage and scarring, which can result in much higher costs, not to speak about these social implications. Fourthly, I want to strike to focus on and to emphasize that time and process matter. In the long run, there is surely no trade-off between growth and the green transition, because we obviously need a healthy world to have a performing economy. We need a healthy world to have an economy, full stop. But the transition between one equilibrium to another, the process to get as fast as possible from point A to point B on a graph, should not be taken for granted. We must not assume that changes happen naturally, immediately, that there are no bottlenecks, no obstacles hindering them, that there are no side effects that need to be incorporated in the decision-making equation. Managing the transition is the key to success, as we see these days with very heated debates related to what we consider clean energies in the transition or how to phase out combustion cars. Fifth point, territory matters. Again, I think I don't need to elaborate here on how social and territorial cohesion are key features explaining economic success, social progress, and also political instability. Sixth, resilience is often invisible. Economic resilience is only measurable when put to the test, as we have sadly learned during the pandemic and now caused by the impact of the war on energy markets. Many investments are needed simply to avoid a negative event, a counterfactual, from materializing. For instance, and this is a classic one, investing in fire prevention is very successful when there is no fire. How can you show that you're successful? We only realize it when we do not invest enough. Investing in cybersecurity can avoid a massive economic damage. The cost-benefit analysis is crystal clear, isn't it? If we are able to put a tag to the counterfactual scenario to assess the costs and the benefits that we're talking about, when resilience is invisible, unmeasurable in many ways. I think this explains the underinvestment in those public goods which are actually critical when there is a shock, but fall down in the priority list in normal times. Seventh, politics matter. Structural reforms are needed for the economy, any economy, to keep evolving and adjusting to new realities. But nevertheless, their success in achieving the desired impact on the ground largely depends on the political process itself. Labor market reform in Spain provides a very good example in this regard, because in contrast to past labor market reforms, which were not negotiated with social partners, we devoted long hours and political capital during 2021 to negotiate the labor market reform with unions and business representatives. We reached an agreement that was then turned into law. So there was ownership by social partners. We preserved social peace, as we have done now with pension reform. And this has led to an extraordinary performance of the labor market during 2022, which is still continuing and even accelerating in this first quarter of 2023. So whereas unemployment, precariousness, instability have been dragging the Spanish economy and led to growing inequalities since the great financial crisis, in just 1 year, we've seen a deep change leading to record numbers in social security affiliations. More than 1 million more persons are working than before the pandemic. The share of temporary contracts has dropped 10 percentage points. This is extremely important for the young persons working and for women. So real results have outperformed our expectations. And I think this was to a great extent due to the political process that led to these agreements and to the legal adoption. Linked to this, my 8th point, democratic institutions, clear vision, leadership. I want to stress the importance of these elements, having a sense of direction and the determination to carry through a reform or a specific public policy. At the European level, just to mention an example at the European level, it is very clear, I think, that the 750 billion euro recovery plan, this next generation EU funds, this is a key political milestone in European integration. Minouche, you have followed Eurozone politics for many years. You know what I'm talking about. This is really a major breakthrough. Because for the first time, 27 countries have agreed to borrow together, to invest together in our common future, and undertake investment and reform plans designed at national level, but aligned to the strategic European agendas in the areas of climate action and digitalization. But this agreement did not happen in a void. It resulted from very intense negotiations between European leaders that succeeded in finding common ground, thanks to the prevailing view in key countries and also international fora on the need to build back better after the pandemic in order to modernize our economies with a more sustainable and inclusive economic model. And in Europe, they decided to share this process. They decided to respond with unity, determination, and solidarity, something different from the response to the great financial crisis. So beyond huge monetary outlays and bulldozing reform programs, the recovery plan provides a clear sense of direction towards a more integrated, greener, modern, fairer Europe, providing citizens with a coherent, attractive narrative that they can identify with, that they can own. So coherent of different policies, interinstitutional cooperation is really key to avoid overlaps, inefficiency, and gaps, and leadership is of the essence when we need to have a clear vision going forward. 9th point, beware of false trade-offs, or do not bring out the trade-off card. Some voices are calling these days to delay the climate transition in order to respond to the challenges posed by the war. In my view, this shock has precisely shown that the green transition is more urgent than ever. For reasons of sustainability, of course, but also strategic autonomy and security. We certainly need to cushion the short-term impact of the war and avoid financial or economic instability, but this should not be at the cost of weakening our ambitious goal for the green transition. Another example relates to trade tensions and new industrial policies, which lead to a call for protectionism or a subsidy war. Whereas history shows that these weakens growth and prosperity, especially in emerging economies. We are all on the same boat. We need to preserve open economies, support international cooperation, and avoid turning back to protectionism and polarization, which have proven time and again in our histories to lead to poverty and conflict. At the end of the day, our goal should be to overcome traditional trade-offs and find workable ways to achieve green, sustainable growth, efficient and fair markets, well-functioning, rules-based international trade, social justice and fiscal responsibility. They are all complementary factors that can be offsetting, so being a trade-off, or reinforcing each other depending on how, where, and when policies are implemented. All of the above, the points I mentioned before. Finally, point 10. I think it's very important that we fight inertia and intellectual laziness. Saying this in this temple of intellectual work, I feel very, but I said I was going to be provocative, okay? Just again, to give you a personal example. So Spain was the first EU country to raise concerns about energy prices back in 2021. When we started to mention this in the Eurogroup and ECOFIN meetings, and the Secretary General of the Treasury is here, he witnessed those meetings. People were looking at me as if I was nuts. I mean, energy price increases? Why should we worry about that? No, we were the canary in the mine, since we have a very flexible wholesale electricity market, which immediately passed through the increase in gas prices to retail customers. We called on European institutions to reform the regulatory framework to try to limit energy price increases. The reaction was not positive by all those that have to do with the regulation that we were actually trying to bring down. We argued strongly for an Iberian solution to decouple gas from electricity prices, and many said this will not work. You're wasting your time. This is going to be counterproductive. Well, since we implemented this solution in June 2022, Spanish consumers have saved more than 5 billion euros, and the average wholesale price in Spain has been significantly lower than in other EU large economies, bringing strong competitive advantage to Spanish firms. So it has taken a long time to get our proposals on the agenda, but we fought inertia and strong resistance to change the paradigm prevailing in many quarters. And again, this is not new. There is a sense of history accelerating right now, and change generates uncertainty, anxiety, and stress in our societies or in public institutions too. So when we talk about reducing fossil fuel demand, raising the share of renewables, encouraging self-consumption or decarbonizing heavy industry through the development of new technologies based on green hydrogen, we are talking about a massive structural change which generates a lot of stress in a big share of our populations. And it should not come as a surprise that many interested parties have tried and are trying to delay it. But change is a necessary feature of life and economics. We need to permanently question ourselves, question our beliefs, question the acquired knowledge, and try to look for new perspectives to the different challenges. Structural change is of the essence if we want to ensure that Europe continues to be relevant in the new world order that is in the making. And if we want future generations, you, your children, your grandchildren, to have a sustainable environment where they can develop their lives and make their own decisions, make their own mistakes too. So this brings me to my final point, homework. An evolving reality leads to new challenges, requiring new public policies, which will in turn require the support of a new economic paradigm. Because there are many questions, many doubts and uncertainties, and we really need to reinforce our tools to understand the world, to assess priorities, to propose credible and well-substantiated realistic decisions, to bring citizens along, to cater for adjustment, permanent adjustment, to learn from experience, to be able to test ideas and escalate them up when they prove to be effective. The economy is a complex adaptive system, and we need 21st century instruments and institutions to address 21st century challenges. And that includes a holistic approach that incorporates all public policy instruments and provides a broad multidisciplinary view to all issues. Universities are the core of this multidisciplinary approach to trying to understand and address challenges. And we're usually so absorbed in our daily priorities and emergencies, in the news and the noise in our lives and our mobile phones and our social media, that we forget to lift our heads and to see the global picture, to look back and learn the lessons from the past, to take new perspectives, to listen to different views, to question ourselves. And I think this is an essential exercise in dealing with what is urgent without losing sight of what is important, to try to avoid making the same mistakes over again. And I think universities play a key role in trying to develop these tools and helping us policymakers make the right decisions and avoid making the same mistakes over again. The future is not carved in stone. Don't let anybody tell you this. It will depend on our actions today. So I count on your passion, your knowledge and dedication to build the tools to change the world for the better. Thank you.
Well, I think it's hard to tell you just how on point your speech was, especially your final sentence, because LSE's current strategy is called Shape the World, and our motto is for the betterment of society. So you completely resonated in terms of what this institution is about, and I'm glad you've given us homework. I always believed in homework, and I'm glad you challenged us, because in many ways this is a place where economic thinking and social thinking has been reinvented many, many times over, and you really sent a very clear message that we need to think again. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with a couple of questions from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I wanted to start with where you started, which is that we've had all these crises, and you basically said we didn't learn profound enough lessons from those crises. The 2008 financial crisis was pivotal, but many of the lessons we learned were very technocratic. We put in place better capital and liquidity requirements for banks. We put in macro-prudential policies. We reformed at the margins, but we didn't ask the big fundamental questions. And I wanted to ask you whether the response to our latest batch of, and everyone quotes the famous Claude Monet quote, Europe was born in crises and evolves and grows with each crisis that it faces. Do you think that Europe's response in particular to the last crisis, the recent crises we faced, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, do you think that's a more fundamental response than what happened after 2008? Are we doing a better job of learning the deep lessons? You mentioned the Next Generation EU Fund, but there are many ways in which Europe has responded very differently to the recent challenges. What do you think?
Well, I certainly lived through the great financial crisis. I was in the EU at the time. And then now I have a very different perspective, being the vice president of a national government, lived through the pandemic and now the war. And I think the response to these three situations is very different. We really learned the lessons from the great financial crisis, maybe not so much, as you rightly say, through the regulatory framework, and there's still some missing pieces, like in the banking union, which was not, carried through to the end in the 10 years in between. But when the pandemic hit us, the way Europe reacted was totally different to what happened in 2008. For one thing, we were fast. So already in March 2020, we set mechanisms to provide liquidity to national governments so that we wouldn't go into a sovereign debt crisis, and that we would have the margin to protect our workers, for example, through short-term work schemes. This was extremely important to Spain, because fiscal instability was one of the characteristics of previous shocks. And so the fact that we could protect 3.5 million workers, thanks to the funding support coming from the EU, This enabled us to ensure that these jobs were not destroyed, and so to have a strong basis for a strong recovery. So we acted fast, we acted decisively. I mean, the amounts that were put on the table. In Spain, we mobilized 140 billion euros in public guarantees to support firms, not to speak about the European Central Bank that said really whatever it takes from day one. So it was massive, it was fast, we acted in a very determined manner, and it was based on solidarity. There was no discussion of we versus them. It was not due to any incorrect behavior of anybody. There was no moral judgment, because we really felt we were all in the same boat when this virus hit us as human beings. And I think this human dimension was extremely relevant in Europe, but also at global level. That's why I mentioned, because we coordinated our policies, you know, throughout the whole world, and it was automatic. It worked so well. Partly also because some of the fora already existed. The G20, I said it back in 2020, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it now, because it really provides for very useful fora, you know, for this kind of coordination. Now, the war is a different animal, because here we're dealing with challenges which cannot be addressed with money alone. No, it's not just a matter of throwing money to it. You know, it's a much more complicated. Geopolitics are playing a key role, and so I think this is posing a different kind of challenge to the European Union decision-making process. But our position as Spain is that we need to respond again on the basis of unity, determination, and solidarity. This is what we have expressed from day one, you know, to support those countries that are now in the front line, like Spain was in the previous crisis, the Baltic states, the border to Ukraine, and not to speak about Germany in terms of the energy dependence. So I think that we have learned part of the lessons, but there's still a way to go, I think, to develop a solid basis on which to continue to understand and try to anticipate. That's the most challenging part of it.
So I wanted to pick up another theme of your talk, which was around public investment, creative destruction, resilience. I sometimes joke that I've had jobs that are about doing good, like working at the World Bank or the Department for International Development or working at the LSE. But I've also had jobs that are about preventing bad things from happening, like the IMF or the Bank of England. And the doing good are, the people who work there are more optimistic and happy. The places where you are trying to prevent bad things from happening, they're more pessimistic. They're always worrying about risks, and you know, it's a dip. But I think what I've learned is that sometimes preventing bad things from happening is more important than doing good, because the losses when bad things happen are so huge. And you alluded to that. So I wanted to ask you about the politics of preventing bad things and resilience, because you said that resilience is often invisible, and the investments that we need to make in resilience of our financial system, adaptation to climate change and creating a more climate resilient economy, resilience to conflict. These are places where you spend money and you see nothing. And for politicians, it's really hard to mobilize the support for those kinds of things. You've been at the front line in politics for a very long time. How do you make the case for investments in resilience?
So that's a very good point. And, you know, as you were describing the types of jobs that exist, I relate very, very well to what you were saying. I have never been in a doing good place, you know, and I throughout my whole career, I was in competition policy where you're saying, no, that's wrong. I sanction you, cartels, oh, this merger is prohibited. You know, I was always in conflict driven areas. Then I moved to, well, I mean, first I did macroeconomic analysis, so this was okay. It's academic-like kind of work. But when I got into the real top management positions, it was always about Then financial regulation in the midst of the financial crisis, you know, so it was like survival mode and trying to put a rein to the risks, you know, that we were identifying. And then I was Director General for the budget, as Professor Rodriguez Pose was mentioning, which, as everybody knows, the budget department is just to say no.
No,
Yeah.
that's your job is to
By
say no.
default, your job is to say no, and then we speak. But first,
First, no.
first no. No. So, and then, of course, being now in the Minister for Economy and Digitalization, I think digitalization is probably the only sort of more creative, or I thought that would be the most creative part of my job. But actually, economic policy has turned to be very creative. It has turned to be a lot about doing good because, as I said, protecting 3.5 million jobs, you know, articulating the reply to the pandemic, now finding the response and supporting families and trying to find the right policy options in a situation of war is actually doing a lot of good, not only avoiding bad things from happening. But your point is something I reflect about so often, because there are so many examples of resilience coming from totally unexpected places. For example, in Spain, we did a large investment in regasification plants, which was considered to waste. So for many years, you know, people said, but why do we have an oversupply of regasification plants? It was built by necessity because we are an energy island. We were not sufficiently interconnected with the rest of Europe. So we had to have slack. We had to have redundancy just in case. Now we have 1/3 of the regasification capacity of the EU. So actually Spain is proving to be one of the elements of resilience for the EU. What was supposed to be a redundancy, a waste, is now an element of resilience. So how to get it right is difficult, because you cannot have redundancies all over the place. That would be extremely inefficient. But you have to identify some core features that make an economy more resilient. And this is where I give you this homework, which is try to identify what are these elements that when a crisis comes, makes you more able to withstand any crisis, because not only the ones of the past, but anyone that may come. Of course, it's a bit of an impossible job, but it's one that I really think is of the essence going forward.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience at this stage. I think Andres is going to, and just to, if you could introduce yourself before answering your question, that would be lovely.
Yes, I'm just going to be selecting questions. I'm going to give, given that we're here, absolute priority to students. So I would encourage all the students. So if you happen to be an older student, I'm sorry about that, I apologize, but I'll go for the younger ones. And then I would like to just highlight one thing that I think is important. These are questions. So start your question, or try to start your question by how, when, to what extent, or what. Don't just make a statement because it's not the point to make a statement. We're going to take questions in bundles of 3. So if you start raising your hand, so we start over here, and just say who you are and where you're from. So. And my question is, where does taxation go at the moment, when it comes to spending, investment, and resiliency of stuff, when it comes to collective borrowing, where does national view global taxation go? Next question over here. By the way, the questions can be either to Nadia or to Minouche, or you can, so please go ahead.
She's the guest.
We both in many different positions, globalization or policy and anything. I think in your talk, Nadia, was you have to come up with this idea of structural change or change apart. I was just wondering if you have any good insight into the qualities that it takes as individuals to help initiate that change, because I think a lot of people and a lot of the interest out of society are changing.
And final question over here, sir.
want to stop dramatic. My question is slightly technical related to your position over the chat with LSE. So, Nadia Calviño and LSE which allowed for a 60 billion program for Ukraine support of the war. At the same time, they weren't able to get the access to poverty reduction growth trust, which they they only able to raise $1 million SDR to target, which is $1 billion, $3 billion. This kind of gives the impression that $60 billion in Ukraine an extra $2 billion more.
Nadia, Minouche.
Okay, maybe I kickstart this. Thank you very much, because taxation is a big part of this debate at national, at European, and at global level. And this is one area where I would like to move faster at the global level, because we reached an agreement last year to establish a minimum tax rate for corporations, for corporate tax of 15%. It was a very important message throughout the world that we would be fighting these race to the bottom of fiscal, tax havens that impoverish all of us when we most need this public funding to develop and to invest in our future. Europe has done its homework, but unfortunately, some other very large jurisdictions on the other side of a larger, ocean are finding it more difficult to do it. I think we have to move ahead. I think we have to establish a fairer system within Europe, And then at national level, I think this is going to be one of the key debates in the coming years in all countries. It is already in all countries. In the case of Spain, we decided to, from the start of the war, we decided, of course, we're a progressive government, and so we wanted to have a fair distribution of the burdens and the impact of the war, which means it cannot be that it's citizens, as always, that have to bear the brunt of funding the response to the war. So we have established some extraordinary temporary taxes on outstanding windfall profits of the banking sector, the energy sector, and also very large wealth individuals' fortunes. There is a very strong resistance. I have to tell you, I've been yesterday and today here in London. I've got many questions on this from many persons related to the city, which I understand, but I am persuaded that this is the only way to ensure that there's some social fairness. So having a fair taxation system is certainly of the essence. And we really have to develop a green taxation framework. Here, another homework, now that you say it, because there are many debates going on this. There are many examples, and we are doing a lot of work to try to identify good practices, etc. This is something that certainly will be key as carbon pricing, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, etc. I think this is going to be one of the top priorities in the coming years. I'll be very fast on the others, but structural change, what are the qualities? I very much like this question. If I have to reply just one word or one advice, it would be listen. Listen, because there are many people who are very passionate about what they believe, but they don't listen to the people that are in front of them. And so they think that everybody thinks alike. And to me, going to work at the EU was a big awakening, because in any country, even in one as diverse as the UK, people have basically a common foundation. They watch the same kind of shows. They have the same understanding of life. They speak the same language. When you get to a multicultural environment, and LSE, of course, this is a bubble. I'm not talking about this environment, which is very much so. You will have realized that suddenly you meet people, and the first thing you think is, this person is stupid, because this person doesn't understand something that is so obvious to me. And then if you listen, you realize that there's something behind every person's statement or view of the world. And when you are a policymaker and when you want to do a structural change, an important structural change, it's extremely important that you listen carefully to the views of those that will be impacted by this change so that you can really bring them along, because otherwise you're going to lead to conflict and frustration. And the third question, which was indeed very technical, but it is a very good question, because I am convinced that we need to ensure that all countries feel that the global institutions are working to their benefit. And I can assure, I am sure, we have discussed this actually, that the leadership of the IMF and of course me as chair of the IMFC thinks that alongside support to Ukraine, we need to ensure that we provide appropriate support and debt relief and all support debt relief actions and provide financial instruments that can also serve the most vulnerable countries, so those that are hit. So, you know, there may have been a delay, but I am, and I will strongly support that we take care of the whole global community, because this solidarity is actually an integral part of having an effective response to any challenge, not to speak an effective response, one that brings everybody with us in such a complex geopolitical scenario.
Minouche, I don't know whether you want to add something.
I mean, I think Nadia covered it brilliantly, but the only thing I'd add on the taxation question is one of the huge issues that we face is the role of tax havens and profit shifting and tax optimization strategies by corporates. And we were this close to an agreement with the OECD, which would have addressed that and made corporations pay tax where they had economic activity rather than some fake postal address in a tax haven. And I do think we need to go back and reopen that discussion at the OECD, because I think it's an important first step in a fair global tax system. And just to completely endorse what Nadia said about listening, all the best leaders I know were good listeners.
Okay, more hands. And yeah, I see a lot of hands from men. I would encourage also women to raise their hands. So we can start over there. Next question over here, sir. Yes. Can you say your name and yes, you over there. Oh.
You mentioned a couple of times how we need to move away from assuming rationality, assuming in terms of we fix everything or that we have perfect information. And I'm curious how you think that fields such as psychology or decision sciences might play a role in policy making moving forward, and also how much that's accepted by politicians and economics tends to be a little bit of everything.
Thank you very much. Your turn now.
Well, excellent question. So, well, actually, Spain had, as I said in my remarks, Spain had the largest GDP growth drop during the pandemic, due to the high share of tourism and tourism-related activities, all those that have to do with social contact. I mean, Spain is a country that is particularly well endowed and able in all activities having to do with social relations. And this is exactly what was cut during the pandemic. Moreover, we did have a very bad impact in terms of health. So these led the economy to drop by 11% in 2020. So despite the fact that we've had 5.5 growth in 2021, 5.5 growth in 2022, the GDP level has not been recovered. Now, you may recall that a big part of my remarks were to say GDP is not the only indicator of success. You know, I am firmly convinced that this is the case, but we will recover the pre-pandemic GDP growth in this first part of the year if the economy continues to perform as it does. And the rest of indicators are already clearly above the pre-pandemic level. I mean, employment, 1 million more persons, and job is dynamism is particularly noteworthy in new areas such as programming, R&D, science, engineering and architecture. So that's a very good sign of the structural transformation. But likewise, with all the rest of indicators, consumption, investment, and paradoxically, this is a joke, but I am confronted with a funny situation where the regions, when we meet, all of them say we are above our pre-pandemic level. So one wonders, you know, if the sum does not, but the parts are already. So, you know, the economy has recovered much faster and stronger than the great financial crisis. It took 10 years to recover the GDP level. It took 12 years to recover the employment level of 2008. In many instances, we had not recovered in 2020 when the pandemic hit us. Inequalities, for example, were much worse than pre-2008. The quality of jobs, you know, many areas we had not recovered when the pandemic hit us, and now the recovery is very different. Now, pension system reform is one of the top reforms that we have been conducting. Spain undertook the key reforms to extend the retirement age in 2013. And those reforms are still now deploying their impact. But what had happened in 2013 due to the financial crisis was that there was a very tough reform, non-negotiated with social partners, that led to a lot of social conflict that was basically freezing pension payments and imposing a progressive reduction of pension payments as of now that would have led to much lower pensions going forward. So this pension reform that we have undertaken, we've done it on the basis of dialogue with the social partners, agreement with the unions. The corporations did not formally agree, but you know, they have not made a, let's say, I think they do understand that this is what the country needed right now, to put it this way. And this reform is not increasing the retirement age, just to explain that this is not the same kind of reform. It is more about how are we going to deal with the parameters of the system when the baby boomers retire, you know, and how do we ensure sustainability going forward. But it is a necessary reform that we did with social peace, and I think that's why I was referring to investing time in bringing people along is sometimes much better, because the other reform in 2013, which was non-negotiated, which was fought against, parts of it were actually never implemented because nobody supported that reform. No? And then thirdly, this is such a good question, and I very much appreciate it, because my call on multidisciplinary approach was thinking and not only about the usual areas where we cooperate, law, sociology, geography. It's more about psychology, but also mathematics, physics, biology, you know, medicine. I think we need our common knowledge and we need to bring it together, and universities are really the temples, you know, for bringing different knowledges together. And implicitly, where I was always also calling for a bit a more humble approach on the side of economists. You know, many people have been a bit, and sometimes people become arrogant because they think my model is perfect, and you know, I have a financial model and this is providing all the answers. And you know, we need to bring together all the knowledge and different perspectives if we want to try to avoid mistakes. And politicians, I think, and the political world and policymakers increasingly, I think, tend to read about and to bring different experts to deal with issues. I think the pandemic has been also quite eye-opening because we all had to become experts, you know, about vaccines and health systems and.
Minouche, please. All right. Asta, please, your question.
And how we can be moving leaders of the community. Also, is there a conversation about value as well, and considering about what people consider value?
Also, please.
We touched upon the new bonds, I think today was approved another package from Ukraine of 6,000 million.
6 billion.
I wanted to know after how the government plans to show us after starting up in one fact, the IMF came to us saying that much information from the government on the usage of the new funds. So how do we know that the government is extremely efficient?
You over there in the corner, yes. So who are you and what's your name, please?
The political debate in Spain is highly polarized, and this makes it very difficult to have enriching discussions, not only in Congress, but also sometimes in universities and in the most which make me very sad. How do you think we can contribute to having a more healthy political debate?
Okay, challenging questions.
It is here, Minouche. I would appreciate you coming in on this last one also with your experience in other contexts. No, I mean, your question is very, very pertinent. It is not a matter of what, but how to value it, because interestingly, we tend to incorporate those things that we can measure. But not everything that counts is countable, no, and not everything that's counted actually counts, no. So it's and this is one of the key elements that we need to reflect upon. Absolutely, what is the value? What is the value added of some activities? No, I have been for the last years working on this beyond GDP and how to find new indicators, etc., with OECD. And the previous Secretary General Ángel Gurría was extremely interested in this work. Now, I think there are now other priorities, you know, right now, but that's why I was insisting, let us not bring this flag down, because I think this is something that we need to do to avoid that we continue to make mistakes by underestimating the value of resilience, the value of investments, value of public goods, and many other elements. And this is not a discussion that takes place in policy making environments or political environments. No, this is more of an academic issue, but one that I think is extremely relevant for us also to take the right decisions. On the European funds, actually, today we received a third payment, so Spain is leading the payments. And these payments are sent to Spain because we fulfilled certain milestones and targets, including having very, very demanding control systems, anti-fraud systems, anti-conflicts of interest. So the whole architecture for implementing and deploying these funds has been set up with a very high standard, which is why we got the payment, you know. And we have now received 37 billion euros from the European funds, which are matching the inflows and the outflows from the Treasury. And the Secretary General from the Treasury is here, and you know, he's following this very closely. They match, so the inflows come in at one point in time, like 6 billion euros today, and then between now and the next payment, the outflows match. And these outflows go to the regions, go to the cities, or go to the private beneficiaries or companies that are going to develop a project. And this is all published, all beneficiaries are published. Actually, what you were referring to was the European Parliament. The Budgetary Control Committee came and checked, and they went out saying, and they were quite impressed by the control mechanisms we had. They said, it would be good if it would be streamlined, processes would be simplified, if the regions would have a stronger say, if you would improve in your communication. And I would agree, we need to communicate better. We were focusing so much on implementation, but overall, I think we have as good as it gets a system, to try to be efficient in deploying the investments. And then before Minouche takes over on the polarized debate, I very much agree with you. And that is why I was saying this is probably the most pleasant moment of my week. In the sense that in an academic environment such as this, I have to say, I would say the same in a Spanish university. I always speak my mind. But it is true that when there is so much tension, but the UK is also an example, and other countries, the US, you're going now to the US. I mean, you're going to see what polarization is. I think it's not productive. I agree 100% with you. Now, what I try to do, I can tell you what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just focus on what's important, try to not get entangled in noise and conflict, and try to show there is a better way, to approach issues which is bringing everybody along. If we are more, then we will be able to succeed, I think, in changing the environment, which is very difficult because the media environment and social networks and the requirements to click and to have people clicking, that is also imposing an acceleration of news too, and leads to more polarized positions probably.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, Nadia, I think one of the reasons this occasion is less polarized and conflictual is, one of the lessons I've had is it's in person, it's not anonymous. We're all in the same room together. We might disagree, but people behave very differently when it's in person and it's not anonymous. And it's, and social media, of course, has it's anonymous, and you never see the person on the other side. And so people say terrible things. I've become a big fan of citizens' assemblies as one way to enhance democratic decision-making around controversial issues. Again, it's in person, it's not on social media, it's not anonymous. From a policy point of view, I think there's two areas that I would identify as key for reducing polarization. One is media regulation. I think platforms are publishers, and we need to hold them to account for what's on their platforms. I don't think, I know there are issues around free speech, but I think if we ask platforms themselves to set standards and then governments can hold them to upholding those standards, that would be a good compromise in terms of both protecting free speech, but maintaining a certain level of standards, including on the nature of the algorithms that they use. So if the algorithms keep reinforcing your prejudices, that's a problem. That's not a neutral thing. That's a choice. And I think that needs to be subject to some kind of oversight. And then the other area I would point to is political party funding, which in many countries has exacerbated polarization. Letting corporates have a legal identity so that they can make major political donations. It's not clear. I don't get that corporates are citizens. People are citizens, not corporates. And I think there are many ways to think about how either better public funding of political parties or having citizens have vouchers that they can give to political parties that they support would, I think, do a lot to enhance our democracy and make sure it represents the majority rather than the extremes.
I think you're putting the nail, you're hitting the nail on the head on that. That man over there, sir.
Very much for your I've been involved in the market for the last 20 years, and I've mostly seen through the crisis after crisis how the government responses have become much better. And the last two that you mentioned, the pandemic and the war, clearly show it. My question is, where is the debate around sort of government debt and the budget deficit? Because at some point, it's been a one-way street. And I think more and more governments are happier to solve those future problems at the cost of, the future generations. So my question is, is there a long debate around it? And from a policy or theory perspective, it has to be an end. Because inflation is finally here, and we saw what happened in the UK back in September.
I'm not sure this situation is sustainable.
Andrea, please. And final rush, please.
My question was, after the region, don't necessarily specialize in manufacturing, IT, what alternatives do they have to globally
Well, these are excellent. These are very bright students you have. I don't know whether selection process is like, but very good.
Well
Very
selected.
no, I mean to come to LSE. No, very good question. So indeed, it is a very hot debate. And this is a very relevant issue. We take that very seriously. In the case of Spain, we're very strongly committed to fiscal discipline. Since we took office in 2018, we were starting to bring down these imbalances. And then the pandemic hit, and obviously we had to issue the debt, we had to support the people. I think this was the right decision. But as soon as we started to resume growth, the growth path, we have gone back down on the downward path. And actually last year, we managed to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 5 points. This was never before had we reduced it so much. And the numbers for the deficit were released only yesterday. And we closed at 4.8% of GDP, which is also below our target. So in this year, if we have growth as expected, we will be below our target. So we are outperforming our own targets, and I think this is the right thing to do. My conversations with investors yesterday and today show that there's very strong confidence in Spain, precisely because we have a very coherent fiscal policy and a strong commitment, in this regard. And this is going to be hotly debated in the second part of the year when Spain will hold the presidency of the European Council of Ministers, because the fiscal rules of the EU are being revised. And they're very different approaches. Well, even a bit less different than maybe 15 years ago, because now the pandemic hit everybody. Everybody is in a more similar position with higher debt levels. And the challenge will be, again, no trade-off. Let's break the trade-off. Let's find a way to have sustainable debt and deficit reduction trends, paths that are compatible with growth and job creation. Because what we lived through in 2011 and 2012, and Spain again is a clear example, is that by generating a recession, you do not ease reduction of deficit and debt. You have to find a way to have a sustainable path of fiscal responsibility. But we will, the Secretary General of the Treasury was just before this conference having a meeting, and I suppose the discussions were quite rich to prepare precisely this debate at the European level. Now, the two other questions are somewhat related, how to support lower income countries and those that are most vulnerable and do not have a sort of fancy kind of a future-oriented economic structure. And actually, it comes this, thank you very much. And we had not spoken beforehand, had we? But, Spain has been one of the countries that have asked or have supported most strongly that the IMF establishes new financing tools to facilitate, to support most vulnerable countries doing the necessary investments in sustainability, resilience, etc. So actually there's this new resilience and sustainability trust, and Spain has been the first country to contribute, which is not a normal event, no, but we have very strongly supported this because I can only agree. How are they going to find the funding to undertake the necessary investments? And we all know climate change is a shared endeavor. We're all in the same boat. You know, this is not a matter of some doing the necessary changes and others not. And likewise, I think it is the multinational institutions that can help support these countries that are also those that are most vulnerable to, for example, climate disasters, no? When there are tornadoes or these are the countries that are also most severely hit by floods, etc. No? So we need to have a common safety net throughout the world. But what is more challenging is how to give them a really sustainable business model, no? And I was just before talking to Minouche about the new head of the World Bank, because this is a very much a World Bank business. So the new head of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, he is of an Indian origin. He comes from the private sector. He's been in many multinational companies. He's a person that's quite understands very well the challenge of bringing out and development of emerging economies. And so I have a lot of faith, you know, in him identifying new ways to approach these countries so that we can have a more structural approach to them, one that really leads to sustainable growth.
Yes. I'm conscious of the time. There are a lot of hands up, but I'm also conscious that we have to finish at 4:30 and that First Vice President Calviño has to catch a plane and there's a strike. So I'm going to allow 3 very short questions. One in first. Your question over there. Can you speak a bit louder?
It's a bit louder or stand up, maybe.
Stand up, yeah. Yeah, but quickly, please. And final question over here. Yeah, you had, I thought you had, yeah, you hadn't later before, so. Quick questions.
Okay. Yes,
Quick questions,
thank you very much.
quick answers, please.
Yes, okay, Next Generation EU, before we start discussing whether it should be permanent, we have to make this a success. I am right now in the phase of focusing on making this a success. And since I think from a theoretical point of view, it's quite clear that the economic and monetary union must involve some sort of a fiscal instrument, and I am persuaded that it will come, you know. And but right now, I think we have to focus in making Next Generation EU a success and take it from there. Then gender gaps. Thank you very much for this question. So I think, I mean, Minouche will surely add. I am a strong believer in gender equality and gender policies, for reasons of social fairness, but also economic rationality, because we cannot waste the talent of 50% of the population, and talent is equally distributed, you know, throughout countries, throughout economic classes, and throughout gender. So we need to undertake policies that really take this as one of the policy objectives, because if we don't do it explicitly, then it just goes very low in the list of priorities. I could be here speaking for a long hour, explaining all the different measures. Let me just give you two policy measures that are really important for closing the gender gap. Equal paternity and maternity leave. We established this, and we see that this is changing the way families are approaching, and also the way women are recruited and in an equal manner with men. And increasing the minimum wage, because this was to a great extent paid to women. So it is already closing the salary gap. We are at the minimum salary gap right now in Spain, and this is also creating incentives for women to look for a job, etc. And then the third point was on the IMF. Well, the IMF has evolved enormously in the last years, I think, and it's good to close with this idea. I think one of the reasons why I mentioned it briefly in my introductory remarks, I think one of the reasons why we were effective in reacting to the pandemic is that there was a shared vision. The international institutions, key governments, analysts, everybody understood that what we needed to do was to coordinate our policies, support the economy, expansionary monetary policy. If there would have been a debate, maybe things would have been different. But the IMF and the World Bank today, I think, have a very different approach in terms of conditionality, and a very different approach to having sustainable fiscal paths, such as the one I was referring to a moment ago.
Minouche, will you?
I would just want to say thank you to Nadia for coming to visit us and for a wonderful talk.
Thanks to you.
If you allow me to say just a couple of words to wrap up. I'm very glad. I'm very thankful, of course, to Minouche, but what I'm going to say you already know, but mainly to Nadia, because you have managed to taste the quality and the pool of talent we have at the LSE. Minouche knows it better than anyone else. And how good, why this is a place that traps everyone that comes in. But for all of you, it's very difficult to get from there to here. But many of you have got the talent to make that jump, and you got the potential. And you have seen what a difference when talented people, especially talented women, make it to this side, they can make to actually decision-making and to make our world, on top of actually having to deal with all the problems and solve all the risk and address all the risk, you can make in terms of making the world much better. So many thanks. And we hope to see you here for many other times. Good.
Dame, Andrés, saquen una foto a los tres. Sí, si quieren, sí, encantada.
Para mí también. Gracias.
Sí, no sé si aquí está bien o nos ponemos allí delante.
Daniel, tell your friends to come and take a picture with us. Look, whoever, everyone, yes. Yeah, everyone.